Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to my first ever live stream and the first video on this channel. So a bit of an experiment for me, exciting time, but hopefully we'll have a nice little play with some simple APIs, and I'm hoping this will be useful for a broad range of people who are Notion users and don't know much about programming, people who've never used network APIs before and would like to understand a bit more about that, and just generally people who want to set up the Notion API and are probably only interested in the first 10 minutes, but that's fine. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders or First Nation leaders of other communities who may be present or may be watching the recording in the future. Brief introduction to myself. My name's Alec, as you've probably guessed, and I've been programming for a good number of years. I programmed on some very old computers, although not quite as old as the computer pictured on the screen at the moment. But I definitely remember using computers that had big rocker switches on the front of them. It was a PDP-11, in fact. I currently work as a developer relations advocate, which means I'm helping people to use APIs. So very much what I'm doing today, in fact, but with our own product called Papercut. I live in Melbourne, Australia, and I work here as well. And as you probably tell from my accent, I originally am from the UK. You can contact me in many of the places as Alec the Geek, so on GitHub, Twitter, GitLab, and so on. So I thought first off I might do a brief introduction to Notion for people who've not seen Notion before. So Notion is a personal information system, quite a popular one. As well as being a personal information system, a lot of people use it to manage their teams as well. But I just use it for me personally, and I think it's a really great tool. It does a lot of things without you needing to do any programming, so it's a no-code environment. It does lots. You can do note taking, so it's a note application. Lots of rich text, rich content support. But the other thing it's got, which is probably its secret power, is the embedded databases. So you can create Notion pages which are just or consist of tables. And if I jump into this page here, this is a task list, and for those of you who used Notion before, this is based on their default task list template. I have added a couple of extra properties or fields across the top here, but it's pretty simple deliberately. So the thing that Notion hasn't had until earlier this week was an API. And so the API got released. I've had a quick look at the documentation. I haven't written anything yet, but I've looked at the documentation, and it looks fairly simple to use. So what I'd like to do is to write something that will use the API, and I'd like to write something that I will find useful. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So the thing is, how do you get started with the APIs in Notion? Well, if you go to your settings and members area, there's a new tab down here called integrations. And we're going to develop our integration. So we click on develop your own integration tab. And we have to create a new integration. So there has to be security between your Notion workspaces and the code that you're running in your API. So perhaps that's a good time to talk about what an API is. An API is a contract between two pieces of software so they can communicate and exchange information. And in a minute we'll be looking at that contract. It's called the API reference. But that connection has to be secure, so if you connect to Notion, they have to know that it's you and that you've authorized this bit of code to actually talk and update your database. So I'm going to call my project Notion tasks command line interface, because we're actually going to be running a command line program so that I can interact with Notion and the command line. I won't bother with a logo. The workspace I'm going to use it on, and push the submit button. And then that returns a secret. And I'm going to show you the secret because I'm going to delete this as soon as the live stream is finished. But you need to keep a record of this, so a copy of this secret, but don't show it to other people. So it's something that you need to keep confidential. And if you accidentally expose this secret somehow, or it gets out into the world, you should remove it from here and create a new one. But that does for now. So I've copied that. I need to go over here and make a note of it. So I'm going to create a new file called notes. And my first bit of information is the API secret. So we'll just cut and paste that into there. Save that away. And it's an internal integration. You can create commercial integrations which you either give away for free or public integrations which you can either give away for free, or presumably there will be or is already some method of charging people for these things, but this is just for me. So I go back to my integrations list, and when you look at an integration, you can, and I did do this yesterday, I deleted one. Go away. Trying to remember how I did this. Go back. There is a way of deleting these. If I go to internal, okay, we'll come back to that. There is definitely a way of deleting an old key and recreating a new one. So that's created our key. That's the first step. The next thing we need to do is we need to link that integration with our workspace. So the way we do that is with share, and we click on the invite, and already our Notions task integration is listed, so we'll just go invite, and that now will allow us to start making API calls and connect to this workspace. So the next thing we need to do is look at the documentation. So again, the easiest way to get to that is to go into settings and go down to the integrations page and tick on the learn about integrations. And that then gives you a link to the developer hub. So this is where I'll be spending a lot of time today. And if you should really go through and read these things, but I'm going to cheat and I'm just going to go straight into the API reference. It's quite a simple interface and it's reasonably well written documentation, so it's no big problem. So the first thing is that's the URL to which we send requests. So I'm going to make a note of that as well. This is a string, so I should probably just turn it into a quoted string. And we need to be aware of all these conventions, like, always use snake case, where the code samples are. And the first thing is authentication. So how do we use that secret that we've got just now? Well, we pass it in a bearer token. So that means that maybe just go back a little bit. So the way that web APIs work, and in this case RESTful APIs, is that basically the Notion system is a web server, and the code that we're writing is the equivalent of a browser, and all we're doing is sending through HTTPS messages that look like a request for a page, so a URL, maybe some other bits of information, and then we're getting a response back but instead of getting a web page back, we get some JSON data. So that's how it works. So we're sending HTTPS or HTTP messages back and forth between the two systems, and as part of that HTTP protocol, there's a thing called HTTP headers, and so we're going to add a header called authorization and put in our secret as a bearer token. And that's how you do it in Node, but we're using Python. Also here to talk about pagination, which is make sure that, you know, potentially you could, if you make a request for information, you could get hundreds of thousands of data items back. So it's important that you just get back pages of information and you page through the information and get more information with a new API call each time you need it. And that's what's called pagination. We won't be looking at that today because we're working with very small data sets, and I want to keep things as simple as possible. We won't worry about any of this later. We'll just go straight into how to retrieve a database. So this is the actual API call you need to make, and the nice thing here on the left is that they've actually given us a command that we could run from the command line to see how this works. So I'm actually going to try that. So if I cut and paste that in, it's going to fail, but let's watch what we get. So you notice that the API token is invalid because I haven't set up the Notion API key. So let's do that. So if I go export Notion API key, and I just cut and paste this value in here, and then run that same curl command again, I got a different error message. So it was, in this case, object not found, couldn't find a database with that identifier, because if you look at it, it's actually looking for a database with this identifier. So let's see if we can do better, because if I go back into my table view here, you actually see the identity of my database, which is that. Whoops, missed the 4. So if I copy that field and go back in here, actually let's make all that nose a bit easier. Go back to reference, copy this again, and here we're going to put the actually going to put the variable to database ID, so that's $DB ID, and we just need to make sure that that is a single quoted string. We'd actually put those quotes at the back, and we should be good to go. So let's export dbid. So I'm setting up a variable now to contain the name of my database, which is this long string here off the URL. I've never tested this before, so I'm assuming this will all work. And now I've set up the Notion API key, I've set up a database identity for my specific database, and I should be able to just cut and paste this into the command line now, and we'll see what happens. Woohoo! It worked. So it's as simple as that. So maybe I'll just explain briefly what that did, although this is not written in Python. This is written in using a program called curl, which kind of pretends to be a browser, and is sending a message to the Notion API, and it's actually sending to an endpoint called databases. So Notion knows that we're going to talk. We want to talk about databases. The default HTTP verb here is get. So when you send a message to a web server, you are sending not just the thing that you see, like the form data or something like that, but you're sending the HTTP headers, which I talked about briefly before, and you're sending a verb. Sending a verb. Lost my train of thought. So verbs are things like get, put, patch, and so on. We'll talk a bit more about those later. But the default verb here is get, so we don't need to specify get. We do have to specify the header, so there's a header for the authorization, so that's what an bearer authorization looks like, and it's also asking for a Notion version header. So that's custom to Notion. You'll see these authorization bearer headers used in all sorts of different places, but this is specific to Notion. Okay, so let's do that in Python. Well, the first thing we need is we need a Python module to help us to do these requests. So this is an HTTP request, and we'll need some software to help us do that. So I've already got Python installed, but I need some extra modules, an extra module. So I just put the name of the module in here, and I save that file away. So that's a bit of Python magic. So if now the other thing that's worth talking about is that I have set up a Python virtual environment. So I'm not going to be installing software or using the version of Python that's installed on my system. And if you're going to do any Python development, you too should look at using Python environments. I can put a link later on in the video description down below with a link to a video to help you do that. But for the time being, I can now go pip install. So this is the Python package manager, and tell it that I have a requirements file called requirements.txt, and it will read that file and install any of the modules I need. And I've actually got this installed already, so it doesn't actually need to do anything. So that's cool. So now let's create a program. Now I'm going to take a very simplistic approach to development here. I'm not set up module spaces or anything like that. I'm not going to use object-oriented programming. I want to keep things simple for people. So let's create a file called NT, which is for Notion tasks. And the first thing I'm going to do is to tell the system to run it with Python. Is my Python 3 set up correctly here? I'm just checking the configuration of my environment. Yep, so I'm going to specify that this is Python 3, because I am using a fairly up-to-date version of Python, so there might be, depending on which version you're using, there may be some slight differences, but you should definitely be using Python 3 and not Python 2. Very important, that. Now then, so the first thing we need to do is we install requests, or we reference requests. So from requests, import, I think we just need get for the moment. And from logging, import critical and debug or debugging. Yes, debug. And I'll need to look up in a minute how to set up debug level logging, because I don't do Python programming day in, day out. I spend a lot of time looking up things in the manual that I forgot how to do from 6 months ago. So we'll do that in a minute. So I guess the first thing I want to do is set up my API key. So again, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to copy it straight into the program. And then I can maybe define a function called retrieve database. So let's call get database. Get database db id, and that is where I start looking up the documentation. So Python, we'll look at how to use that request module, Python requests. So it's pretty simple, it's just get. I don't need to say request get because of the way I imported it, so that's a bit easier. I do need to set up the headers. So get the URL is the first thing, so that's can't remember if it's a string, but it will try. URL, it has to be base. Slash database. Databases, and then the actual database ID. So this is actually the call. Now I do have to define the headers, and if I go into the requests documentation and look at this get sessions cookie. Oh, here we go. Make a request. So if my memory serves me right, there's actually a headers option as well as a data option. Custom headers, there we go. So that's how we do it. So the headers are always the same, so we can just define them up here. So custom header is equal to, and we got two of them. So and we can just copy this from the examples. So authorization bearer. Do you have to quote the keys? Yes, you do. Ah, because it's a dictionary, not a JSON object at that time. So, yep, authorization bearer. And we just stick our API key in here, API secret. And that's all you need to do. And I forgot to make these formatted strings as well. So when you say F in front of the string, you get the magic that it pastes in these variables for you without you having to do it yourself. So it makes life a bit easier. And the other custom header which is needed is, sorry, back and forth, is the Notion version. So we can say headers equals custom header. Is that the right way to do it? Again, go back to documentation. Headers, it is headers, headers. And then once we get a response, so we need to save that response. So the first thing we need to test, and this is pretty important, is you need to test the return status. So in the same way that you post a verb, you know, when you send the message up, you post a verb, for instance, and the headers, when it comes back, you get an HTTP status and headers, as well as any payload content. So the first thing to do is to check the response, and how do you check? How do you put the HTTP status? Delete option. Passing parameters, response content. It's R something, is it R status? Here we go. It's R underscore, it's status code. So I should be able to print and again HTTP status dot status code. So now I should be able to just call get database. And did I define my database? No. That's dbid equals remember, we get the database name from this URL up here, so it ends with a 4, starts with a 4 in this case. So I'm just going to pass dbid in like that and see what it gets me. So if I change this to be executable file, and it's a file called nt, and then I should be able to go nt. And I made a mistake. Invalid syntax. dbid equal. Oh, because I didn't quote it. I got 400, which is, so I'd expect to see 200. 400 is an error. Everything with a 400 is an error. HTTP status code. So where are we? 400s. It was exactly 400. Bad request. The client should not repeat this request without modification. So there's something wrong with the way I've done this. So I'm doing, first of all, am I doing a get? Is that the first thing to check? So it is a get. It tells you up here with this get. V1, is that been in the URL? Oh, okay, the URL is goes up as far as there. I've actually missed out the V1, the database version. So what I'm going to do is put in an API version, which in this case is equal to lowercase v1, I think. Is that lowercase? Yeah, I think that's lowercase. V1, and I'm going to create a new variable called endpoint. Actually, that's not a good name. We'll call this server. So server equals that, and the URL base is so we got an API version and a server, and so the URL base on which all the calls are must be made against is a string which consists of the server followed by a slash followed by the API version, then end that string, and then just go down here. Yep, so that should work now, I hope. I got 200. Awesome. So we'll just make that a debug statement now, so I can display it if I need to. But now we're going to return. So we get back a JSON. So I need to decode this into, well, actually I may not need to decode it, I think. So we're getting back JSON, and what we really want is that content in a nice friendly Python dictionary. And I think request does that for you automatically, which is one of the things that makes it so awesome. There was a whole section up here about processing payloads. Where are we? Passing parameters. Response content, JSON response content. There's also built-in JSON decoder. That's fabulous. So we just say our JSON. In this case, there's JSON. Our JSON raised an exception. So we'll just assume for the moment that it's valid JSON. The accessor failed call to our JSON does not indicate it assesses the response. That's very true, that. So what we should be able to do is just return the JSON. So what's happening here is that we've got a response back from the server, and when we call a method called JSON on that response, then that returns actually a Python dictionary with all the nice stuff that we got. So so if we save that DB content, and then we want to pretty print it, I'm just going to dump it out in a print statement for the time being and see what it looks like. Save that away. How are we doing for time? Yep. I'm hoping this will take less than an hour and a half. Depends how far we get. Let's try it now. Ooh. Awesome source. So this looks like JSON, but it isn't. It's a Python dictionary. And we can access all sorts of interesting things in here. So there's the idea of the database, when the database was created, when it was last edited, which was today my time, because this is in ISO 8601 format. So universal time coordinated plus the time zone offset. And then we've got an array of things. Let's have a look. Let's have a look at the documentation. Retrieve a database. So we get type text annotation, properties. So I'm not sure. This does this title mean rows in actual fact? So a title consists of no, it isn't. Something else. Then down here we have something called food group. Oh, it's describing all the columns in the database. So these are all the properties. Multi-select options. I need to pretty print this and then I'll be able to understand it. There is a pretty printer which I can never remember in Python, which will print it out nicely, but I can never remember how to use it. Python. So that's why we have internet searching. Preprint. Import preprint. So you have to create a pretty printer object. Okay, we can do that. I'm not going to get too fancy here, so just install preprint. Why doesn't it like... That's a spelling error, not a syntax error. Okay, so we set up a pretty printer. And then we just call the pretty printer printf method. So that's like that. Let's try that. Okay. It's a database. So it's telling us the database. Then it's telling us what the properties of that database are. Okay, so that's telling us what the various so where it's actually not telling me the content of the database. Have I missed a trick? Probably have I misread? Reduce the database object using ID specified identifier. Oh, it only tells you about the database, it doesn't return the data. So we actually need to query the database. Okay. Where's my first assumption? Right, so okay, so that tells me some interesting things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this get table schema, just because that makes more sense. Because effectively, what this is a table, and in Notion terms they call this a database. So maybe to avoid confusion, I should actually call get database schema. Although if you come from a relational database world, that is confusing, but we'll do that. We'll try and stay with the Notion terminology. So get a database schema, and then we have to have get database content. So let's say query thing. So interesting, that's a post request. And you have to give it a JSON object, which is a filter. So if I leave that blank, will that retrieve every single row in the database? Filter, sort, start cursor. So it doesn't have to be supplied. Doesn't have to be supplied. Get a list of pages contained in the database, filtered and ordered according to the filter condition. Let's try it with an empty body and see what happens. So this is very similar to the last function, but this is actually going to return the pages in the database. So in Notion terminology, these are not rows, these are pages, because they are pages, because if you look at, for instance, this row here, you can actually open the row and you get a page, and the page can contain rich content. So it's actually not just a row, it's a full page. So we'll get some interesting stuff. So therefore I'm going to say get database page. Maybe it should be get page in database. Get pages in database. And again it's dbid. And this time it's actually not a get, it's a post. I suspect the reason it's a post is because some systems don't allow you to have a payload with a get, even though technically speaking that's okay. And then you have to add query onto here, and I'm going to, just for completeness, say that this is blank. I think that'll work. And DB content. I'm going to return two things. I'm going to return the status code and the JSON. And similarly here. So in Python it's okay for functions to return multiple things. HTTP status and DB content. If HTTP status not equal, no. I think that's you do a string compare that way in Python. Exit -1. Critical. Get database call filed. Oh, that's database schema. There, isn't it? And and that's HTTP status. And now we are going to do exactly the same thing, but with get the pages in the database. To get the pages in a database, and if it failed, do this. I'm not going to bother to print out the first thing, but I will print this out. This is probably going to be very big, even though I've only got 3 rows. Actually, if you want to do something there, that if I did have an error, it would fail. From sys import exit. Then if something happens, it really will work. Okay, so this time we got content that properties, context, options, color pink, name, work desk. This looks like the properties again. Am I returning? Get pages in database, DBID query. I've got a suspicion this returned nothing. Well, then that should be nothing. So yeah, I think this is still all the properties. This is the properties object for that database. Let's go back and look at this. So probably ought to put this header in there as well. I could just do that for all of them, it doesn't really matter. Custom headers. I like to put double quotes for content and single quotes for keys, although it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, but just a little convention I try and follow most of the time. Excuse me, please. Oh, didn't like that. Failed with 200. Get database schema called failed because, maybe just because I put that in. No. What's happened this time? Is it a string? So I've actually assumed that the response is a string. Oh, okay. I'm doing it wrong. I should be saying requests codes And I also haven't imported that method. Post. Oh, that was why that wasn't working. So in order to get to the database content, you need to do, oh, I did do a post. So instead of us actually hard coding 200, there's some predefined magic variables, so we don't have to worry about type or anything like that. So now if I do this, we get something better. Name code is not defined. Oh, it's codes. So I've just worked out that that is actually the content from here, but it still doesn't look like real data. It looks like properties. Maybe just to be pedantic, I'm going to blank out the return values just to double check that I'm not picking up from the last call. I don't see how I can. Nope, I'm not. Let's be really pedantic and use a completely new variable, because I don't understand the content I'm getting back. Ah, these are object pages. So that's its parent, that's its properties. Oh, so, okay, so now I think I understand. So if I talked about the fact that, we've got this table with these properties, but if you open one of these pages, i.e. one of the records, it has exactly the same it has the same properties duplicated. So when you get delivered one of these pages, embedded inside the page is a description of all the properties. So you get it twice. Name. There is content property for a unique one. So call the vet. I think it might be useful to put this out onto a text file that we can then open in the editor. And if I go full screen, bring this down, that makes it a bit easier to look at. So this is an array. So it's an array, so it returns a results field, and the results field is an array of pages. So if we scoot down here, So that's the end of that first page, which is called the vet. This is the beginning of the next one, which is edit video, and that's the last one. There's 2 pages. Where's that? The array for, oh, here, title. So that's the end of that one, and then this is the last one, I hope. Again, another page. Take the dog for a walk, and there's the end of it. And those are the 3 records that we've got on our task list. Okay, there you have it. So that's getting every single record out of a particular database. I don't know if anybody else online watching or anybody's got any questions so far, any observations? So we've made some progress here. I'm really, and this will be quite tedious, I need to go through and write a thing to extract all the relevant information. So probably I just need to iterate through the results. That would be a good thing to do. So I've now got DB pages for page in DB pages dot results. Print page dot, what things could I print? So here's a result. It's dot properties. Page dot properties dot name name, and I think it was plain text, wasn't it? Plain underscore text. I'll be surprised if this works on the first go, but we can but try. Object has no attribute results. DB pages, it says results there. Oh, it's pages dash results. And so page properties. This is tedious. I wonder if there's a better way of doing this. Are these all dictionary? I think there is a way of doing this that's easier, but anyway. Plain underscore text. Okay, key error, plain underscore text, because name, title. Oh, title is an array. Annotations. I have to put an array index in there as well. So key error 0. But you see, this title thing here is an array of dictionaries. Actually, it's not annotations, it's title. So it's not actually, annotations is not the right thing because this is it. Oh dear. I'll just print out title and see what that gets me. Oh, that's interesting. What have I missed? Name. Title. Name. Title. Maybe that's 0. I don't think that was a furphy. Boom, as they say. So we're getting there. So this has been an hour of coding to get to this stage and me talking. I'd like to thank you for your patience, but I'm probably going to call it a day. If you've got any interest in me seeing more of how this develops, then leave a comment in the video below, and maybe I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks a lot. Bye.